ensure that we find a way of calibrating indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge so that we can take advantage of the good things about indigenous knowledge. Involving people in land, I think, would be important. People are actually central. You have a lot of female smallholder farmers that are women that I think should be part of the solution as well. And women, because they involve in a lot of land-based activities, and because a lot of the problem areas related to land tenure and land tenure rights are affecting women as well. And if it's affecting women, then it is affecting their ability to participate fully. If women are starved of information on how to make land more effective, then in other words, they're not going to be able to contribute to reversing some of the depletion and degradation that I've talked about. The D for delayed action, I think, is a recurrent theme in the report. You know, if we delay action, we're going to be faced with some hard choices. We're going to start pitting land against food, land against bioenergy, and those are going to be very difficult decisions for us. So we must try and make sure that we are leaving ourselves enough room so that we can act more effectively. We want to react in a proactive way rather than a reactive way, because the reactive manner might also incur problems, especially in terms of our governance systems. So how do we preempt and take remedial action, and how do we do it proactively, I think is going to be fundamentally important. And our dependence on land for food, this is my last slide, dependence for land for food, for water, for fiber, I guess has to be matched with our determination that we have to deviate from disruptive practices, because if we don't, this would have implications for our climate and climate resilient development. So yeah, that was my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. We have another author from the IPCC special report who focused on risk and response. I bring to you Jagdish Krishnaswamy, and he's going to help us out with that side of the story.
Yeah, one of the challenges of coming at the end is a lot of the good stuff has already been said, but I will also have the last word, I think. So.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, fine. Okay. So we've already heard about the land being a very finite, precious, and critical resource, and that we need to think about how much burden we are going to place on land for various competing demands. So this is about achieving core benefits through managing land and climate risks. So more than 70% of ice-free land is already under direct or indirect human influence of one kind or the other. So, so clearly, the decisions that we have to make about allocating land to various sectors is going to be critical in the coming decades in terms of our ability to achieve sustainable land management with adaptation and mitigation co-benefits. And in terms of trends, we are seeing areas, populations increasingly being exposed to desertification. Drylands are in terms of internal variability in drought. There's a rising trend there as well. Then we have lost a lot of our inland wetlands as well, which is so these are big changes that are limiting our ability to cope with the climate change. So sustainable land management is one of the the solutions which would effectively combine the use of land resources in a very comprehensive way, which includes soils, water, biodiversity, to meet changing human needs, while simultaneously ensuring the long-term productive potential of these resources and the maintenance of the environmental function. So this is basically what we would like to foster. And so how we use land is going to be both a problem and a solution for climate change. That's clearly one of the, so here you have examples of various kinds of land use, rangelands, attempts at reforestation and restoration. So these are all key components which have already happening or have happened in many parts of the world. And we have a lot of important lessons. When we assess the literature critically, we found a lot of hope for adoption of many of these response options. My hardworking colleagues in Chapter 6, they looked at all the, the rich diversity and hundreds of case studies around the world of response options, much of which is very familiar to this audience, including, for example, in India, we had the Integrated Watershed Management Program, very, very large program, and lots of important lessons from a lot of successes and some failures that we can draw upon. But the difference that was, I think, in terms of the focus here was to look at all the response options and also look at synergies and trade-offs with respect to mitigation, adaptation, desertification, land degradation, food security, and also the costs of applying those response options. So, and applying this lens of synergies and trade-offs, and also their ability to in terms of being adopted, is one of the things that emerged out of Chapter 6. And also in terms of the positive and negative impacts they're likely to have in terms of quantifying that on a scale. So you have a bunch of response options from around the world, and of course it's very region and context specific, but overall the assessment of the literature suggested that there is quite a bit of confidence about the ability of many of these response options to be effective in terms of adaptation and mitigation co-benefits, without too many trade-offs for things like food security and biodiversity. And however, there are land management options with a large mitigation potential, so based on the literature, there's also a confidence level, low, medium, and high associated with that. And so this is an area, since we are talking, this is a science day, so there are, wherever we see that there is not enough literature or not enough confidence about a particular response options, synergies, and trade-offs, that suggests that that's a knowledge gap that we urgently need to fill soon. And as well as applying to off-land in terms of the value chain options with the large mitigation potential have also been assessed. So if you look at a landscape like this, and the synergies and trade-offs have to be managed. So there are various decisions that have to be made. How much of a riparian strip do you have along the stream? How much of water are you going to share with the downstream communities? Where are you going to be having a land sharing or a land sparing approach in terms of sharing land resources between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and other human needs? Also, if you're going to have biochar in this landscape, is the biochar going to come from invasive species, or is it going to come from some other biomass? So these are all critical questions that have to be assessed by policy and decision makers at all levels of governance, and which requires, it's quite a complex task to have a sustainable land management at a large spatial scale, and clearly is a big challenge. And there are interlinkages of these response options So some options clearly have benefits of all the land climate challenges. And some response options are interlinked. Some have co-benefits or are more effective when paired together. So that gives us a choice. Not all options increase competition for land. Some response options are less feasible than others, and this depends on the region and the biome. And so this is just an example. So in our land report, we have a land sector, land-based mitigation, and you also have energy mitigation with land implications. So, and many of the deep cuts in emissions are going to come from renewable energy. When we assessed the literature, we also came across possibly barriers to adoption of, for example, wind farms or solar farms. So this is one of the papers cited in two of our chapters in the report. So clearly, this requires spatial planning and zoning. So there are also solutions which are emerging from the literature. Again, when we are when there are competing demands on land at various spatial scales, the role of spatial planning and zoning is going to be critical. So in terms of how do you foster sustainable land management and adoption of response options that have a lot of synergies with the food security, biodiversity, and ecosystem services, and minimize the trade-offs. Clearly, the role of indigenous and local knowledge plays a critical role, as has been mentioned by Fatima earlier. Also, involving people in decision-making at all scales, including secure land tenure, and is an important ingredient of the ability of building the capacity of people to actually to adopt sustainable land management practices. And collective action is also an important part of it. It's not only about governments. It's basically going to be a mix of policy instruments that will foster this, including partnerships between government, the private sector, local communities. So the enabling response options will require measuring and monitoring our progress in this, and there are lots of technologies and data available that will enable us to do that. Investments in these capacities, including access to observation, early warning systems, seasonal forecasts are going to be critical, because adoption of sustainable land management and restoration of land productivity is going to take some time. And in the meantime, we have to have lots of measures for helping people adapt to the climatic stress. And in the policy context, it's a mix of policies that can encourage the adoption of sustainable land management based on the regional context. These include regulation, like land use zoning, land spanning and land sharing approaches. Land tenure is an important ingredient of success. Also, voluntary and persuasive instruments are also available. For example, changes in diet, cropping patterns, standards and certification for produce that comes from sustainable land management, awareness generation, citizen science, indigenous knowledge, and collective action. These can play a big role apart from what governments can do. Incentives for example, for conserving or generating ecosystem services, and also risk sharing so that vulnerable communities are protected against extreme events and so on. And so I'm going to end here, and this is basically where you can download the report, the summary for policymakers, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Jagdish. Now, we're going to bring it all together. At least one way to think about this is that's a lot of information. These documents, some of them are 1,500 pages long underneath. We're not talking about just the documents. We're talking about the major data sets that go into trying to understand the Earth and the trends that are going forward. In the old days, we had lots of databases. Now, we're trying to move from information to knowledge. And I introduce Doug Kripe from the Group on Earth Observations, which is the global multilateral entity that brings governments and the Earth observation community together to try to work together and solve that problem. Doug?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. How's your PowerPoint saturation level? Probably pretty high. I hope you've got space for just a little bit more. So as Baron mentioned, I'm from the Secretariat for the Group on Earth Observations. How many of you have heard of Geo, on the Group on Earth Observations, just out of curiosity? Okay, so a good number of you. Very good. So I don't need to really go through too much here. When we talk about Earth observations, just like to at the outset mention that we're interested in all observations. So whether they come from remote sensing, whether they come from in situ, marine, aircraft, and so forth, we're talking about all types of Earth observations from a variety of platforms. And GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, was initiated in 2005 as an intergovernmental partnership to work towards opening up access to data, Earth observation data. And this has been manifested in a number of ways. Probably you're aware that all of the archives of the Landsat program in the US are now fully and openly available, as well as the Sentinel data from the European Commission's, European Union's Copernicus program. So we are working towards this as a kind of default position with governments so that land degradation can be assessed with the widest variety of data possible. The vision for GEO is that we have a world in which the future is decided for the benefit of humankind and is informed by coordinated, comprehensive and sustained Earth observations and information. And that's what we're working towards. So not only are we looking at providing Earth observations, providing access to them freely and openly, but also we're looking at applications of those Earth observations, and that's what I'm going to talk about in the remainder of my talk here. Just very briefly, in the GEO governance, we have a plenary, an annual plenary, which is comprises the governments that are in GEO, as well as participating organizations such as UNCCD. That's why we're involved in LDN. And others are UNFCCC, the WMO, other UN agencies, and we run the spectrum all the way to research institutes and those entities out there that are working towards standards. For example, the Open Geospatial Consortium is also a participating organization. So anyway, annually we get together and we decide on the future of GEO. And a few years back, we were given the mandate by plenary to focus on supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. So we're looking at how we can provide Earth observations to support these global policy initiatives. And SDG 15.3.1 in particular is an area that we're interested in. So I borrowed a few slides from Baron's presentation that Baron gave at our last plenary back in November in 2018 in Kyoto. And I'm sure you've seen these slides before. I don't need to linger. But the point here is that monitoring LDN status comprises two phases. One a monitoring or where we are kind of phase, and then the second phase is an assessment phase. And how do you do an assessment? Well, you have to have time series of Earth observations or other kinds of data to let you know how you got from A to B, where you are today. So this is why we are interested in helping the LDN assessment process. And some of the data sets that are used are illustrated here for the sub-indicator. The first sub-indicator, the European Space Agency has provided a lot of data. For the second sub-indicator, on productivity. That's the JRC, the Joint Research Center, has provided information there, and then soil organic carbon stocks comes from the ISRIC grid. So these are the initial data sets or data providers that have participated in setting the baselines for those countries participating in this particular SDG. And we at Geo are interested in going further, looking at how we can provide higher resolution at greater temporal scales, particularly when you speak to people from small island developing states, the SIDS. They have an issue with resolution because sometimes the islands are smaller than the actual pixel resolution by the satellite sensors. So we're working on solutions to how we can overcome these kinds of problems. I just want to point out here that what I highlighted here in red is that the data are not regularly produced by countries. In other words, this particular SDG 15.3.1 was elevated to Tier 2 status, as you all know, but it's conceptually clear, it has a methodology, but the data are not regularly produced by countries. And this is where Geo can help bridge this gap and provide the necessary information and data to do that. To kind of conclude here, what is missing from a Geo perspective, from the group on Earth observations, until now we've been working towards access towards data. But what's missing are the ways in which we can support our member governments to fulfilling their commitments under global policy. And SDG 15.3.1 is a particular case. The solution that we're proposing is, or is leading up to this idea of a knowledge hub, is that a knowledge hub that would provide easy access to products and services that have been developed in Geo. Geo is interested in a broad variety of topics and domains, not just land degradation, but everything spanning from biodiversity and ecosystems to disaster risk reduction and so forth, as I've mentioned. And we're looking at how all of the activities that are happening in our work program, contributed by the member governments and POs, can be better leveraged and made available, can be scaled up to the society at large. So we want to provide access to not only the observations, but the methodologies, the code in some cases, and in an open science context, and then also provide cloud computing facilities should that be necessary. Our current director, Gilberto Camara, is from Brazil, and he was the former director of INPE, the Brazilian Space Agency. So he's keenly aware of the issues that especially developing countries are facing in accessing Earth observations and using them. So this is behind his push to make this information available and lower the barriers for developing countries to use it. So we're developing something called the Geo Knowledge Hub, which, as Baron said in his introduction, will try to bring all of this together that we've been talking about. It's going to be a repository for providing reproducible science and knowledge to the full community, not just the Geo community, but to anyone who is interested in having it. Very quickly, I think this is my next to last slide, what the Geo Knowledge Hub will look like is this. It will be a set of curated, indexed documents that provide you methodologies, provide you data, algorithms and software, and results, so that in initial phase you could reproduce the results that are provided in a particular methodology, and in this case we're going to be looking at those that are used for SDG 15.3.1. And then, since it's open source, you would be able to adapt and modify that to your individual needs, to include perhaps some local in-situ data that you might have for verification or for other assessment purposes. So this is what we're working towards. We're going to present a prototype of this at our plenary coming up in November in Canberra in Australia. And we're excited to be a part of what UNCCD is doing. We have well, my key message here is that GEO is designed to provide intergovernmental coordination for opening access to Earth observations. Through the Knowledge Hub, GEO can increase access to Earth observation data along with improved analysis capacity and tools to help countries set and assess their LDN targets. And we're going to, as I was saying, we're going to present the prototype of this at our plenary in Australia coming up. And we are featuring a side event tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, bright and early, in the same room as IPBES having theirs in MET 06. So you can have breakfast with us, you can have lunch with them, hopefully somebody else will give you dinner. And, but this side event is going to dwell on the initiative within our GEO work program for supporting land degradation neutrality, and I hope to see you there. Thanks very much.